So I'm Magnus, CEO and co-founder of Sanity. I'm Norwegian, based in the East Bay. I'm a I'm actually a finance guy by training, noob developer. So I'm a bit new to the startup world. Used to work in private equity, but I love this community. I love learning about all the ways you build businesses and develop businesses. And very happy to be here to speak to Sherrod today about customer success. How about you, Sherrod?
Thank you. So I'm Sherrod Patching. I lead the technical account management team at GitLab. Technical account management team, or TAMs, essentially is synonymous with the technical CSM. So you may hear those a little bit interchangeably today. So our team is globally dispersed. You probably are familiar with the GitLab model, but we're a DevOps platform if you're not. I am from Canada originally. I moved to England when I was 19, spent about 16 years there, and then moved to the West Coast about 9 years ago. So I've been all over. I'm not quite sure where I consider home anymore, but love them all dearly.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for being here and looking forward to this discussion that we're going to have. And maybe before we jump into a little preamble here about what customer success really is, I'm curious, how did you end up in customer success?
Yes. So I actually trained in music initially. So worked as a musician up and was doing jobs on the side and leading teams on the side, but was working in music full time in England until I got to about 30 and then realized that I probably wasn't on a track to get famous. And so I should probably pivot into something that was going to pay the bills a bit more steadily. So at that
Love
stage,
it.
got into digital. So I led a digital agency. I'd had the leadership background, and so I started leading a digital agency and got excited being exposed to some technology that we had internally and the opportunity of scale that technology brings. And so at that point, then moved across to an AI focused company in London and led at the time what was a client services team. So before customer success was really kind of coined. And then from there, just kind of fell into it. So moved to the US and to the Bay Area, no less, where we have a much further along at the time on kind of what customer success means, and have kind of built a career from there.
Oh, that's really cool. So we're similar to that regard. I think I was 35. I was even later when I realized that there was this world of technology that is super cool and super nice to be in. Cool, thank you. So maybe we could start there by talking about what is customer success, and probably many definitions, but how do you think about what customer success is?
Yeah, so customer success is about ensuring that we are aligned with a customer and their business objectives. So not just that reactive, if you have a question, I'm going to answer it, but actually aligning with what a customer is looking to solve for and ensuring they get to those solutions with the ultimate goal of ensuring that we keep our customers and that they grow. So, from a business standpoint, we ensure that we have happy customers that stay customers and grow. And from the customer standpoint, we're someone that partners with them to ensure that they are getting the solution to the business pain that they had that drew them to us in the first place.
When you think about that, and you said earlier that it was called client services before, and it could have many names. Like, how has this field developed over time? And I'm sure it's still developing. But what does it come from, and what are some of the underlying ideas that has been driving the development of this field from your perspective?
I think one of the primary things that I've seen, and I've actually been on this journey with a few companies now, is I think a lot of customer success, particularly out of the gate a number of years ago, was around feature function. So how do we ensure that we are proactively showing you how to use maybe the features from the new releases or whatever it may be? But what I was just referring to earlier about that shift to business. So the platform is a vehicle for you trying to solve your business pains. Your goal is not to understand every feature and function. Your goal is to solve your business pain. And so customer success really shifted a number of years ago now, but we're still seeing this. And it certainly happened a number of years ago in more mature markets, but there are a lot of companies that are just now figuring this out for themselves around how do we take the CSM of the technical team away from just pointing to features and actually talking about business objectives. And then GitLab, as an example, becomes that vehicle for solving that. So we're trying to solve for improving cycle time or reducing security risk. We're not trying to solve for them knowing where all of the buttons are necessarily.
Mm. Yeah, and what are then typically, if we take an organization like GitLab, this fairly large organization, but if we start with like the vision, what does a customer success team look like when you're at that kind of size, and what are the typical core responsibilities or outcomes that is owned by that team?
Yep. So every company is different. We assign a technical account manager when a customer pays above a certain ARR threshold. So that's how we go about it. Other companies may assign, particularly in a smaller state, you may assign them to all of your customers, but you segment your customers. So maybe you might have one technical CSM or CSM assigned to 50 customers in the SMB space, or 100, and one assigned to one in the enterprise. So you can think about different ways to go about determining who is going to get a TAM and how much of their attention, or a technical CSM. But that's how we think about it. Typically, what you see in the industry is ARR per head. So the industry standard is 2 million. However, if you're a small company without a lot of processes, without a lot of frameworks, it could be a lot less than that, just because if teams are not, if you're not at a point where you're able to support what the teams are doing through systems, then it could potentially take more time. There is a lot you can do around determining the capacity of your team, but quite frankly, talk to them all the time, understand when they, I think it's an active conversation with your team in the early stages to determine what their capacity is and to try and build a model around that.
And for an organization, how many in total would that be in your organization in GitLab now?
How many do we have? Just shy of 50.
Just shy of 50. And I assume there's, if it's a bit like sales that are a little bit better, that you start with everyone being the same and then it specializes a bit over time as you develop. What are kind of the distinct groups inside inside the customer success or the TAM organization that you lead now? Are there like 2 or 3 or 4 different roles? That is the vision of where you're going with your customer success organization?
Yes, there are. So some companies will choose, particularly if there are very nuanced kind of industries. A lot of us with GitLab, the way that you use the platform can be quite similar regardless of the industry that you're in. So we haven't kind of gone deep into industry expertise. We really focus more on kind of SRE. So we may have team members who are more familiar with our security features or more familiar with our CI features. But the way that we actually segment our TAMs is to do with size of customer. So we have an SMB team, a mid-market team, and an enterprise team. And for us, SMB is companies up to 100. Mid-market is 100 to 1,000, and then enterprise is 2,000 and above. So we have TAMs associated with both. They all carry the same book of business, which for us is 3.6 million. And then in SMB, that could look like 100 customers. In an enterprise, it could look like 4 potentially. So as you can imagine, the depth of which you're able to go with that customer differs depending on kind of your size of book of business and also the expectations of that customer.
And we're going to talk about the roles and the responsibilities and the outcomes in a second. But do you also have certain people that are more technical responsible and certain people that are more business responsible? Or is it all the same but split by the size of the customers and they all have their different accounts, if you see what I mean?
It's the latter for us. You see different models. So sometimes you'll see a TAM and a CSM model where you have a CSM who's going to own the business conversation and a TAM who maybe overlays on a set of accounts. We actually have a TAM that is more like a technical CSM. So it is someone who truly owns that customer lifecycle. They own all of the onboarding, the enablement, the expansion into the account, but they also are that trusted advisor for technical things. So we draw the line with hands on keyboard. We're not a PS team, but we need to have the technical chops to be able to meet our developer audiences where they are. So we ask both, which makes it a harder profile to hire for, but a more, in my opinion, a more orchestrated experience for the customer.
And are these philosophical choices? Like some people like and think it's better that way or that way? Or is it more like driven by the kind of go-to-market motion you have or the kind of company you are or the technical level of your product? Or are there some like golden rules for whether you go here or there? Or would you say it's just a preference of what you like?
I have seen it be a preference so far. If there is a model, I've not seen one. I do know that there are a number of customers or companies rather that have reached out to me personally to talk about consolidating the CSM and TAM role into one, because the challenge becomes overlap and cost, right? So is there truly enough of a differentiation, or are they actually just sitting on the same calls together? So I would recommend you start with one before you start exploring 2, because attribution is complex and it's expensive to have 2 people servicing an account.
Yeah, and it's one thing that at least I felt we bumped into pretty early, that we were trying to figure out our product. Sanity as a content platform is very technical. So of course we're figuring out a lot of our customers needed that technical follow-up, but we also saw that there's a lot of general customer success managers who are less technical and more following up the business. And we're scratching our heads figuring out, should we have both, or should we just send more technical people in? Because at the end of the day, that's really what drives the success of our customers, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess if you were trying to debate, the question is, do I get a less technical person and try and teach them to be technical so they can meet the customer where they're at? Or do I get a technical person and try and teach them more about that, having those business conversations? And we went for the latter.
Yeah. So what's then a typical profile of a it seems like now, and I think this is worthwhile for those listening in. Like you would say a TAM and a technical CSM is interchangeable. You told me the other day. It's the same thing.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was news to me. And what's the profile then? How could you explain like a typical TAM or technical CSM profile at the GitLab?
We have some interesting backgrounds, actually. One of our strongest TAMs comes out of actually the recruitment team. And she wasn't from a technical background, but she had a hunger to learn and loved the product, was using the product in her role. And is just, I think a lot of it is like a natural curiosity and aptitude towards more technical conversations. But we also have people who have come out of embedded engineer backgrounds, PS backgrounds, support backgrounds. So typically the profile that we see more often than not is people who come from engineering backgrounds who have that as a slant.
Hmm. Yeah, but you could see both, and it's more about the interest for technology. And I would assume it's more about the ability to communicate technology and listen to people
Yes.
than it is to really understand. Because after all, we're talking about a different thing that solution engineers, because you do have that as well, right? That helps, or pre as post sales, whatever you call it at GitLab.
We do, yeah. So they'll come in and do the more hands-on deep dive demos and that kind of thing. If we're going to get into into a demo environment and start actually working through some of our features, then we would partner with the SA on that. But a lot of this is just about ensuring that, to your point, that we're listening to the customer, that we're able to understand some of these things. Our documentation covers a lot of things, but it doesn't cover a lot of our third-party integrations, for example. So it's, the TAM becomes that wealth of knowledge of being able to guide a customer on where to go to find the information that they need.
Exactly. So what's then typically, maybe we should dive over to what they do, what they do. Like what are the typical like two, three tasks that these people do? And what's typical one or two ways that you typically measure them?
Yeah. So if I were to boil it, I'm going to oversimplify it, but I think any TAM who owns a customer lifecycle or any technical CSM does kind of three things primarily. So they onboard a customer, they ensure a customer is enabled in their existing use cases, i.e. the things I wanted to do with your platform, and then they expand them into additional ones. So that is a gross oversimplification, but you could really boil down everything we do into those three topics. So when it comes to onboarding, do they have what they need to be able to be set up correctly and securely and all the things you'd expect to see? Do they understand what maturity looks like within the use cases they're planning on doing? That might for us be SEM, CI. And then where do we go from here? How do I help you drive additional return on investment through using more of the platform, because it's a win-win? So those are kind of the three areas that we would really boil down any technical CSM or TAM to own. And the metrics kind of follow those same. So what onboard time to first value? So the first time they really receive value from the platform, total onboarding time, ensuring that executive business reviews are actually being held, that we're having those conversations. That's probably for a more mature motion. Understanding product utilization, the maturity of that. If you know that a successful customer uses these three things, are they using those three things? And if not, how do we get them from 2 to 3? So it's really looking at those pieces. And then when we think about expansion, then the metrics are around how often are we expanding into our customer base? Where are we not seeing expansion? Then how do we overcome some of those objections?
Yeah, and expansion, I know we spoke about. That's a little bit of a disputed area. Some people would say it belongs with your organization. Some people would say it belong with sales. How can what's
Yes.
the thoughtful look on both of these sides?
Yeah, so there's kind of expansion into additional use cases, and there's expansion from upsell. So we have tiers at GitLab. So I think when you think about, we actually partner with sales. So oftentimes the opportunity to drive into additional tiers comes through success in their existing use cases, and that is very much a TAM-led motion. But I think when it comes to who owns the dollar, that can be a pretty hot topic, to your point. So I think it comes to, for us, we actually are both incentivized on that. So we have kind of a joint number. It does roll up into the sales number, but we actually have our teams, part of their compensation is based on growth. So we're hyper focused on ensuring that our customers are growing. But yeah, I think when it comes to who owns the dollar, it ultimately comes down to who gets to make the decision, who owns that motion. I think there's a camp that would say that essentially if it's a fairly transactional kind of renewal or upsell, it makes more sense to keep it with the CSM simply because you're not also paying commission on that. So if you just think about it from a dollars perspective, it is cheaper to have your CSMs run those plays. But if you think about it from a negotiation and a commercial standpoint, you've brought in someone who is very good at being able to do objection overcoming and all of the kind of commercial conversations. If you want that, then it may be worth paying the X% to ensure that you're getting the upsells in your deals in addition to your CSM. So that's kind of the decision matrix, and thinking it comes in part down to cost and kind of what's going to be more effective, not necessarily efficient.
Yeah, and I think also as at least for me at the stage where we are at, as a founder, is not so much about paying the commission. Of course, it is like the total economics of the business is important, but it's really about making sure we win it. And
Yeah.
at least that we don't
Yes.
lose those customers. And you
Exactly.
said here the other day, like the incentives people have for just keeping customers happy could speak towards having it in your department instead of having it in the sales department. That salespeople could be less interested if it's less of an upsell opportunity, at least with us, because we don't pay commission on renewal. I'll pay a commission on an expansion to our sales team.
Yes.
We keep it at sales because we have. I'll leave that on the side, but we have it at sales.
Yeah.
We don't have a broad CSM function. We have solution engineers, but not a broad CSM function in the classical sense yet. But how do you how can you judge whether you have the situation of salespeople lacking the incentive? How would you think about it in order to make that decision? Because that sounds like a big driver to me.
Yeah, so I've seen a few different models and been a part of a few different ones as well. I think if you're not going to pay any kind of renewal or any kind of commission rather on a flat renewal, then you do run into the challenge of potentially, you think about an AE who's either going to spend a lot of time, maybe it's only flat because it's challenged. So maybe there's a lot of kind of fighting that needs to happen to even save that customer. If you're asking an AE to do all of that kind of struggle to keep the customer and then you're not going to pay them commission, it can be quite challenging to keep them kind of going in that direction. And so as you can imagine, the easiest thing to do as an AE, if you're not getting any commission on a flat renewal, is to not spend your time on there and spend your time on pipeline that's going to potentially close. Also, too, the other one can be where there's no growth. So you end up having customers who have basically sold to all of their developers. And so it's not even that the customer is challenged, but there is no growth there. And you want the AE to lead these kind of AE motions, but the AE is not particularly interested because they're not going to make any money off of this customer. It's how it's set up. So so in that instance, what I've seen a lot of companies do is start to have a renewals person. So they sometimes live in CS, they sometimes live in sales, but they are purely focused on the renewal. And so they might get 2-3%. Every model is different, but that is their primary focus is gross retention. So ensuring that every dollar that you have of the dollar that you own today is renewed.
That's great. And let's go back to the measurement, because at the end of the day, this is a very, as you say, it's a very transactional focus. It's about making customers happy so that they stick with you, so that they upsell, and at the end of the day, it's about revenue. You mentioned earlier the three ways that you measure. Could you say something about if this changes depending on what kind of business? I think most people listening in on a Heavybit chat like this are PLG companies. Some may not be more standard enterprise, but they're all sorts of different business model. The CSM sounds often to me to be very correlated with the enterprise sales motion. But how should PLG companies think about this? Is it any different? Should they think different about it when they grow up, or how do you think about that?
We are also a PLG company. It's before my time when we opened the enterprise motion. So to your point, yes, you oftentimes do see the CSMs come in as you're starting to engage with a different caliber of customer who expects a different experience. So we grew very organically and continue to do so. But as we think about engaging with our larger, and most strategic customers, it doesn't work just to have in-app support anymore. So I think there is definitely a motion. We work very closely with our growth team because we're constantly looking to have a better experience for all of our users through the platform and through Docs, of course. So we want to ensure that it never just moves to a hands-on all TAM motion. You want to enable a customer to self-serve to the best of their ability, and that's really how we closely partner with growth. So the more you can do around chat or in-app experience or better UX or all of those things, you should solve them all. They are cheaper and they're a better experience because they hit on every user. But that CS layer is oftentimes bringing in on maybe higher investments where a customer feels like, regardless of size, I'm paying you enough money that I expect things, I shouldn't have to find things myself. And I think that's really where that kind of inflection point of bringing in CS begins.
So is there such a thing as like a programmatic CMS function person who like growth is growth, and they care about engagement, they care about a lot of those things, and I can see it's very similar. But at the
Yes.
end of the day, they're often could be measured on somewhat different things. Would you have any separate people who think about the strategy, the CSM strategy for self-serve people, or will you be measured somehow as a TAM
Yes.
organization on those kind of things to make sure you get the incentives and things done? Or
We do, yes, and I could talk about it all day. So essentially, there's the notion of a digital TAM, or they call it a tech touch CSM, digital CSM. You'll hear this. So essentially, what that means is we look to see trends where customers are moving away from adoption, and we try and solve that through content. So we look to see. So we actually do have a digital program at GitLab. And so one of the things we do is we actually have, from the moment a customer becomes a customer, they start receiving emails that then point them to various different areas of docs to kind of guide them through the gotchas around setup or ensuring that they have all their security elements in place, so on and so forth. We do the same thing around kind of CI. So we guide them through our CI utilization, and then we can do things based on kind of triggers when we see license utilization drop or when it increases. There's a number of different things you can do, both through where the customer is in their life cycle and also where they are with feature consumption, to start using that to trigger content. And that is by far the most scalable method when you think about reaching all of those customers who potentially won't ever pay enough that they necessarily could warrant a TAM or a CSM.
yeah, I never thought of this, and this wasn't on our list of pre-planned questions. Maybe the line we're down now, but it's super interesting because the whole PLG motion drives a lot of new, I guess, disciplines and ways of working, and they often bump into each other. So this bumps quite into growth, but it still sits in the CSM organization. Am I correct to understand
It
that?
does. Yep. Yeah. But we work
What?
closely with growth on it, and you're right. And we partner a lot on these initiatives. I would say between growth and customer marketing, we talk a lot.
Yeah. Well, what kind of people would do that kind of job?
Growth or
No. I mean the programmatic, or what did you
got
call
it.
it? The
Yeah.
digital
So
CSM?
digital CSM. Yeah. So
Yeah.
we've hired people out of a programs background. Actually, the person who leads our programs was leading growth for another company previously.
Mm, yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense. So typically number savvy, tech savvy people, but also some writing skills, I assume, in terms
Yes.
of the communication, but quite a
Yep.
different skill set than your normal TAM then.
Very, yeah. So we call them a programs team. It's kind of the motion is called tech touch or digital touch. We don't even call them CSMs. We call them the RCS programs team.
Okay, but it sits in the same organization, so it's
It
kind of
does.
customer success. It makes a lot
Yep.
of sense though. If you think about sales, you got the inbound and you got the enterprise team, and a lot of businesses are like that. So yeah, that was enlightening. Thank you. Let me back to some of the questions. Yeah, let's move over to talk about uh, earlier stage companies. And when we spoke up front, you said you haven't been a founder without the CSM organizations. You can't speak to what people like me should do. But I think there's a lot of learning for us. You explain how the vision should look like. One of the things I can explain from my background was when we had gotten the first kind of larger deals at Sanity, we understood that these customers needed to be maintained, and we did it probably not in the right way. A lot of it was founders and salespeople trying to stay in touch, and it got very skewed. Like some customers got a lot of our attention, some got less. We didn't get a lot of churn. We're lucky with that, but we realized before it went too far that we need to do something proactive with it. And we heard about customer success for a long time, and we need to take some choices. One of the big challenges I found was, where do you start? What's the kind of personalities that you could think about being good in a small CSM team? How should you look for, and where should you find those kind of people? Who are they?
Yeah, I think I gave you a tongue-in-cheek answer when you asked me this before, but I would look at the resources that are in your competitors or in the landscape. And I mean, ideally, if you're looking for the first one, you want someone who's done this before. I've seen a lot of companies hire player coaches, so someone who's maybe has minimal management experience and is looking to build a bigger team over time, or is looking to get into management and has chops from maybe leadership in other areas. But you want someone who's done it before and knows what they're trying to build.
And when we actually went the other way around, we hired one of our customers,
Oh,
and
well, that
someone,
too.
yeah, and it's something. It was probably by we knew this person from before, and he was very technical and really understood really understood the product, while at the same time understood customers and business. Seemed like a good match for us. Um, but but this, I can see there are pros and cons. But if you, the first thing maybe I should have asked is the timing. Like when should you really think about hiring this? How can you think about when's the right time to hire someone who's solely focused on this question?
My recommendation would be as soon as you're able to. So
Mm,
you talked about kind of we've got a customer model and it's a lot of kind of reaching out. I mean, the goal with customer success is building repeatable motions that customers can follow. So rather than waiting till a customer has a question, it's in onboarding, we want, ideally customers should be doing A, B, C, and D. So we kind of need to be guiding it. And we understand that every customer is a snowflake. However, there are going to be consistent things that customers should be doing on our platform that's going to lead them towards success. So, just get them doing that. So you've got one person who's just focused on, and maybe it's then there are a couple of additional use cases where customers, again, just need to do A, B, C, and D. And I understand that everyone is going to be slightly different how they approach it, but that just fundamental guidance, kind of that taking it and proactively guiding a customer through, that's what we do. And that's the piece, is if you can get someone early on to begin to guide your customers through that, so they're less likely to set it up incorrectly and have scale problems because actually the foundation is poor, or less likely to never end up using it because it's confusing and your documentation is lacking, or all of the things that it could be. If you can get someone in there proactively guiding your customers from early on and building out what is it that we want the team after us, I think, so my short answer would be as soon as you can afford it.
that was a really good answer. I'm just going to remind the audience here that we would love to have questions in the Q&A, so we could soon move over to answer whatever you wonder about customer success. And let me grab back to your answer there. As soon as you can afford it, which is obviously, it's always this hard priority early days. Maybe you're seed funded, maybe you're Series A funded, but you don't feel like you could, like you don't almost feel you can afford anything. But you said something, and people, it's about teaching people the onboarding and telling people, is it maybe so that a leading indicator of this is the kind of questions you have and the kind of work you're doing with customers? Because I assume if you start looking at churn, you're too late. Like that's the
Well,
lagging
exactly.
indicator of this work, right?
Exactly. Yeah. You could wait until then, but it'd be a painful lesson.
But what kind of, so if we assume that a leading indicator is the kind of learning they need or materials they need or help they need to get onboarded, and that's what you should look after, then what how do you define what lies under the customer success area? Because you already, at least for a PLG dev-centric company, you already have a set of docs. Maybe that lies with engineering, maybe you move some over to DevRel. So you're already kind of doing some things in your PLGs, or you're thinking about how people get onboarded. How, well, how could you have a mental model for what kind of content and learning should sit within the CSM team and what should sit in other parts of the organization?
Yeah. So we don't try and move people away from docs. We try and
No.
have a single source of truth, and docs is it. So what we try and do is provide a curated experience through docs, right? So just because everything is in a doc doesn't mean that the customer is going to be clear on what A is versus B and where I should go first and all these pieces. And also, too, I think that they're going to actually thoroughly do all of these steps. So my recommendation would be you choose a single source of truth and you stay there and it's docs. So we try and kind of build curation over that. So we have email campaigns that say, hey, customer, welcome. First, you're going to do this, but it points to docs. So, and next you want to do that, but we're constantly driving them back towards docs, but it's that more curated experience through.
This tackles really good into one of the questions we got. Then who owns the documentation? And the question that we explicitly got here was, what are your thoughts of putting the documentation team under CS or under product? And maybe we could like add to that based on what you just said. What is, if CMS doesn't own docs, what is the relationship with docs?
We have a close relationship. So we actually hired with the blessing of the Susan Tacker, who leads our docs team, we hired a technical writer who's a part of our CS programs. So she collaborates with the docs team. She writes our emails, she writes our content, but she also too collaborates on the docs as well. So we took a bunch of the kind of quick start guides that we'd written and moved them across to docs, and she worked with the docs teams on that piece too. So I don't have a view on taking docs. For us, docs rolls up into engineering. I don't feel strongly about that changing, but you'd have to work closely with them for sure. Otherwise, and particularly
Mm,
because in our team too, one of the muscles that we're still trying to build is that as you're working with a customer and you're finding things that are missing in docs, or maybe it doesn't work quite the same way that it did, or it needs to be augmented, we're really working with our team to continue to open MRs and to actually iterate on the docs ourselves, right? That's very much the GitLab way of like everyone contributes. So it's not just that these precious docs over here, but we all own this and we own the customer experience. So if you see something wrong, fix it.
yeah. And have you ever heard about docs being owned by a CSM team?
No, I haven't. I mean, we have a technical writer, but that's as far as we go. I'm sure it exists. I've not come across it though.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So so the docs typically sit there. You say you drive everything back to the docs. Is there any kind of collateral or any library of any other sort for maybe the larger customers or anything that sits in addition to the docs, or is everything back to the docs and GitLab obviously also the handbook?
There, yes, thank you. There is. We actually are still building this out. Some companies have got this much more robustly. We're still, a late stage startup, so this is the part that we're building. But we have a third party kind of education suite that it allows like kind of curated journeys. So we're starting to build out all of our onboarding onto those. But they're iframes essentially of docs. So essentially, the emails drive customers to Edcast, which is the platform that we're using. And it's kind of a click here. We can track attribution, where people come from, how long they stay on a page, all the things you'd want to see in analytics to get smarter about your digital. But the actual content, there's some framing content that gives context to what we're showing, but the technical content is actually links back out to docs too. So we're building that as an experience on top of docs.
But this is interesting. Let's continue there. So I understand everything drives back to the docs. One thing that we asked ourselves when not too long ago, we were asking ourselves the enterprise kind of plan customers, the bigger, they pay you more, they're sold by hand, it is not self-serve. They require more attention. They also pay you a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow they should get value for that. And they need more onboarding. And we were asking ourselves whether we should create separate onboarding tracks, because in effect, the solution engineers and the CSM team would be doing that a little bit by hand. You should try to automate that. How should you think about having that exclusive for the larger customers? That kind of goes a bit against the PLG philosophy of really getting everybody up to speed. Are there situations where you should create exclusive content for enterprise as part of the broader product offering? Or is that just a bad thought to follow?
I've not come across that. So typically what I've seen is that you end up with saying that for an enterprise customer, you need to work with a services team to ensure that you've got, because the complexity of the build can be much more broad. So I've seen there definitely be different experiences that are available to different customer bases. So maybe only content to SMB, whereas mid-market might get content plus some kind of best practice, and then the enterprise with a big investment is kind of looks more like a PS engagement. I've not seen content only be available to enterprise, but it probably exists.
Yeah, yeah, I can see arguments for and against it. I'm curious about two questions, I guess. How does a CSM tech stack support for the work you do look like when you're more mature? But also, where should you start? What's the first thing you should think about when you start building this function out as an early stage company?
Yeah. So there are CS platforms out there. The one that we use is Gainsight. I've used that through a few companies now. It plugs into, it's an app essentially inside of Salesforce. We use Zendesk, of course, a lot too. We don't actually answer tickets, but we keep very closely to understanding what our customer tickets. So that Salesforce, Zendesk, Gainsight is where we live. But for young companies, really, there's just nothing wrong with spreadsheets. I think I've gone into startups that are very, very early stage and spent 2 weeks trying to find out like who are our customers and when do they renew. And if it has to live in a spreadsheet, then so be it. I think that's a fine place to start.
People who know me, they know I love that answer. Like figure out what you're going to automate before you start automating it, because there's so many nice tools. But yeah, in not too long, you need those tools. I've heard about Gainsight as well. Are there other tools, or is the world of CSM inside Gainsight mainly? Oh, you mentioned Zendesk, of course, but other than that, are there other things that are there in your space as well?
So for us personally, we teach our customers to dog food or drink their own champagne through GitLab. So we spend a lot of time in GitLab. We open up a project for each customer, and we contribute and collaborate with the customer through issues in those projects. So our team spends a significant amount of their time in GitLab, as you would imagine.
We do the same with Sanity, and that is always a good thing. Cool. We have a couple more questions here. So someone is asking, what does it take to actually become a good CSM?
So my answer is, I have always said that it takes the ability to have the macro conversation and the micro. I think you need to have someone with natural curiosity who really does want to get in and truly understand the tech. I think there is a flavor of CSM who's more like the business conversations that's not interested in the tech itself. That just doesn't work here, in my experience. So I think you need someone who loves the detail, but also can have the macro conversation. The last thing you want to do is put your only CSM in front of one of your buyers, and just have them talk about kind of low level kind of features, or maybe some of the technical challenges they're overcoming. And I think that's actually really hard to find. So someone who can have those kind of, I can talk to you about your business, or at least about what you're trying to solve for on this platform. But I also too can get down into the weeds and better understand some of the challenges and how do we overcome them. So that kind of macro and micro, and I think you can weed that out through asking them to give scenarios. So tell me about a time when you overcame a customer, and how did you overcame a customer problem, and how did you communicate that to the buyer? And so I think you can weed out their ability in interview processes by just having them tell stories. I think the more you can get them to talk about their experience in hiring someone who's done this before, the easier it'll become to find that. But it is the macro and the micro, a natural curiosity and an attention to detail.
And really what I hear from you is like at GitLab, you have to be technical, but there are other companies where it's more about the more businessy elements because it is a different kind of product. And
Yep.
with GitLab, you need to be more technical, and you really need to understand how it's applied with the customers, because at the end of the
You
day,
do.
that's the value you need to drive for them. Do you use health score, and how are they set up? I assume health score for your customers.
We do. Yes. So we have some of the things I talked about earlier, this kind of onboarding, kind of enable and expand. We have scorecards around all of those. So we have a scorecard, and then I'll talk about a couple more. So we have scorecards for, we expect a TAM or a CSM to speak to a customer within 14 days of having sold, because the customer's excited, right? You miss that opportunity, you take a month, 2 months to get to them, and they're probably annoyed by now. If they're even willing to talk to you. That's one. Two is like time to value. So what is that first inflection point? For us, it's about 10% license utilization. So when is, they've gone beyond just the admins, and now they're starting to onboard team leads, developers, right? So we track that very closely. That's also a scorecard. And then total onboarding. If onboarding goes too long, you're starting to get into kind of halfway through the contract or worse. Now you're talking about potentially having to extend your contract with them, or even having potential churn as a result of not seeing return on investment. So getting them out of onboarding quickly, but ensuring that they are set up for success, that's key. So we have scorecards around those. We have scorecards around executive business reviews. You'll hear that in the space instead of kind of QBR as a quarterly business review. We do ours once a year. So the term is executive business review. We track that those happen. We track that we have a success plan in place, that we do have a plan with the customer that goes beyond just the features they want to use. So it's about like quantitative business metrics, cycle time, deployment frequency, those kinds of things. So we track that that is actually in place, that we've set that up with the customer. So that's one for us. We also track how long since we last spoke to the customer. So with an enterprise customer who is a named account, which they're one that we have a strategic opportunity with and that we're focused on, we should be talking to them no less than once a month. And for our customers who are strategic but maybe need us less, then we say what no less than every 60 days. And we have scorecards that change color when a call hasn't been logged in that time period, so we can understand, is it just a hygiene issue and we need to speak to one of the CSMs, or actually is a customer not talking to us? Because typically if a customer stops talking to you, they either have not found value in what you've had to bring to the table, so you need to iterate on what you're talking about, or they're talking to a competitor and there's potential risk there, where there's something has gone wrong. And so being able to see across your customer base who's not talking to you is incredibly helpful, particularly in the higher paying customers.
And all of this is measured inside Gainsights, that you connect
Yep.
it and track it. So that's your dashboard. And it's a lot of metrics around how you interact with the customers, and
It is.
the kind of discussions and the frequency of those discussions. There's also a question here: what is the data you analyze in order to identify risk of churn ahead of time? And a part of that answer could have been what you just said, obviously, because that is
Some
the
of those
proactive.
things.
But I
Yes,
assume there's also other things that goes more to the product usage metric,
of
or is
course.
there another? Yeah. What
Yep.
are those things?
Yeah, so license utilization is a no-brainer, right? So if you get to the renewal and they've only utilized 75% of their license, it's quite likely you're going to see a 25% haircut, or they're going to ask for
Hmm.
money back, or or an extension, or all the things that you may expect to see. So license utilization is huge. But then also too, we look at use case. So for us, we have a series of use cases across GitLab, and we've been able to see over time that if a customer has only adopted one of our use cases, they are much more likely to contract or churn than if they've adopted two or three. And three is that sweet spot for us. So we're always trying to ensure that we're working with customers to get beyond just SEM, for example. So that's a key piece for us. So even if a customer is completely happy, we consider it not completely green if it's only doing just SEM with us, because we understand that there's still risk.
And is that something you could track with the programmatically with the software they're
Yeah.
using? Because so in GitLab you could do that. In our product platform, we would probably not be able to do that because different use cases would look the same by API calls, etc. So we would probably have to
Sure.
do that manually then. But we could do the same thing of trying to understand how much of or how much value they're getting out by the diversity of use they have. That's
Yes.
something we should
Yep.
definitely look at. What else?
Exactly.
Are those two things it, or are there a couple of other that are key that you measure also?
So I would say it's
Or you
all those
analyze?
so all those key engagement things that we look like, are we talking to them? Did they onboard in a timely manner? Did they get to value? And that then coupled with all the product usage data, I think those are the two key ones. Are we having the right conversations with them? Those kinds of things. There are also, we have one scorecard called TAM sentiment. Um, you'll see this a lot across a lot of companies, because sometimes you look at all the data, they're using all of the features. We're having all the right conversations. They're talking to us all the time, but they're just not being very successful in what they're trying to do, maybe for lack of knowledge or lack of
Mm,
guidance or whatever the case may be. And they're not getting any value from it. So, and those having a technical CSM or a TAM talk to your customer, sometimes they're just going to find out things from a conversation that you can't see in data. And so we have that
yeah.
scorecard that has the heaviest weighting. It actually has a 50%, 51% weighting. So as soon as a TAM marks anything red, the
Mm.
whole thing goes red. It doesn't matter what they're doing with product usage data or if they had a good onboarding experience.
So it's kind of like a rating the CSM
Mhm.
does in Gainsight that would
They
then usually impact the scorecard of that customer.
it basically, yeah, it has the heaviest weighting. So as soon as a TAM says anything is red, then the whole thing turns red essentially.
We had a question here about handovers and do the CSM get introduced prior to signing the contract? If not, how is the handover managed? And I guess the question is really like, how do you secure the best handovers between sales, solution engineering, and customer success?
Yeah. So first of all, everything I'm saying is in our handbook. So if you haven't ever seen our handbook, you should go and look. It
Classic
is
GitLab
awesome.
answer.
That's not my answer, but I do want to preface this with that because all this is in there. We've just been through a process actually of further defining our SA to TAM handover. So we used to do
Oh,
AE to TAM
cool.
handover, but you've got a
Uh-huh.
non-technical resource handing over to a technical resource, and so my worst nightmare in CS is that game of telephone where you call up someone to talk about your problem, they transfer you departments, and they ask you all the same questions again. It's just the worst. And so we want to ensure that everything that was given to us in the pre-sales process is carried across, and that the pro-sales is just a continuation of that same conversation. We understand what you're trying to solve for. We understand what you're looking to do. We've been through those. I don't need to ask you discovery questions again. So we've just shifted from the AE handover to, so there's, I think if you search for SA TAM handover in the GitLab handbook, you'll see our latest iteration there, but we've just rolled out a more robust product or process rather to ensure that the customer feels fully supported and that they trust their TAM. Because what we've been finding is if you don't hand off well, the customer just wants to keep talking to the SA, right? Because you built trust in the pre-sales process and they don't trust this new person who doesn't have the context.
An SA solution architect, I assume.
Yes, yeah. So they typically lead our
So,
pre-sales. But yes, but to answer the question, we do introduce the TAM pre-sale. Oftentimes, we'll do some kind of like POV or technical evaluation. Once we know that the
mm,
customer is most likely moving forward into a sale, at that point, we'll then introduce the TAM so that post-sales experience is seamless. We do that for enterprise. For commercial, we don't. It's a much higher volume of
mm.
customers, so we wait until the sale is closed, but then we very quickly introduce the TAM.
Yep, that makes sense. And in terms of securing this handover, and yeah, I also hate answering those same questions. That happen so many places.
It's a bad experience. Yeah.
It's so bad. It's so bad. And but the answer is technology, because I assume
Yes.
obviously communication between people as well. But is there a system then? Is all of this somehow inside Salesforce that whatever's written down by the AEs and the solution architects or solution engineers, sales and pre-sales, it pops up in gain sides because it's all Salesforce. Is this? I guess I'm asking. Is this a systems question or is it a process question?
It's both. So we use Google Docs. We all collaborate on Google Docs together, all through the customer through the pre-sale. We do always as a business. That's kind of one of our key things that we really pivot on. So we ensure that all the notes are in the same place. But some of these technical conversations, I haven't seen something where they could be translated into something that can just automatically be handed over without context. Not yet, anyway. So we use Google Docs so that everybody's contributing to the same set of notes. We have context up top, but then we also use GitLab too. So we'll also open up that project for the customer when they're a prospect. And so we do as much as we can to kind of keep things in central locations that everyone's contributing to. But there is a level of handoff that needs to happen kind of between people.
When it's handed over, how do the sales people, I assume they already get their commission. And in GitLab, the retention and the upsell is a customer success matter. Are they done then? The solution engine, the pre-sales and sales? No, how they interacting still?
Yeah, so sales stays on it for the longevity of the customer. We don't yet have a renewals team. We're just starting to explore that in commercial, but we have, and the reason being is because we're a land and expand, right? So usually when a customer comes in the door, it's just the beginning of our partnership. It's certainly, they don't come in at like all bells and whistles and having completely explored GitLab for all of their developer teams. So for that reason, we keep the sell in the account. The SA comes off of the account. And then there are two times primarily when an SA would go back into an account. And one is when there is an opportunity for a tier upsell. So selling new features that are not available to them, kind of in all the demo and, you're getting more into the technical weeds of what that potentially could look like. And then the other is around kind of like our security features. And it's like tier upsell is the primary one, but the other one is kind of around when there needs to be a hands-on demo or a proof of value to move into something. So typically the sales will come in to lead those motions.
Yeah, it's a question of AEs, if they're comped the same for initial sales and expansion. So it ties to this question you just had. It's simply, are the AEs comped in the same way, I assume percentage for sale and expansion? If not, do you think there slows down sales velocity because reps are trying to get larger initial deals? Good question.
I actually don't know. It's not my wheelhouse enough to know. We have just rolled out a new kind of a hunting team, essentially, so a new logo team who are just purely focused on new logos, because that's been a big one for us. So I know we're bifurcating compensation strategies based on that, but I actually don't know what our comp looks like for the sell team.
We do it completely the same. The percentage comp is the same for an initial sale and the expansion, and there's no compensation for a resell. And this is exactly the reason I think you don't want the sales cycle prolonged by someone trying to sell for a larger deal than they could have to, or the customer really wants, just to get a higher compensation in the beginning. So that's how we do it.
So one thing I would counter on that is that we have historically sold smaller deals and grown them into much larger deals. What we have found, though, is that when you sell a small deal, that you've pigeonholed a set of budget that maybe isn't available for another year. So we sold it for 20 instead of 50, and now there's not 50 till next year. But two, we led with a smaller, like maybe SEM only, and then let's try to get into CI, then let's try to get into CD, then let's try to get into security. We didn't talk to security teams up front. So once you bring in the security teams, it's a longer sales cycle to this question's point. However, it meant by having a longer sales cycle and including all of the people and going for it, because what we were finding is that people just pigeonholed us in their own minds as GitLab the SEM solution. So we've sold 20 with the intention to get to 100, but we get stuck at 30 because we can't get into these other teams because it wasn't perceived as such up front. And the buyers that we were talking to, they see us as this SEM solution because we didn't position ourselves as a DevSecOps solution. And that we've had to undo and get ourselves out of. So we are learning that the longer sale and the bigger sale with the kind of bells and whistles from the beginning has been a much more successful motion for us.
I love it because we've been feeling that pain also, that if you go in too low and you try to limit yourself, then you're viewed as a limited thing as well. How did you then go about, or is this then is back to the change on the sales side you're talking about on how they run it. It's not something that impacts directly how you do, or does it impact you in the customer success in some way? Like, do you have strategies for like immediately clearing that up? If they bought this part of GitLab, you immediately start giving them success on something broader to expand their view or something like that? Or what do you do?
Not immediately, because I think if
No?
you, some described to me once as, if you hire someone to come paint your house and they paint half your house and then start asking for references, you kind of want them to finish the house first. That one stuck with me. So yeah, I think, once someone has bought you for something, you want to make sure that you kind of get them set up. And maybe there's an opportunity, but most likely they're not going to introduce you to other teams internally until they've seen some level of success. But it does change the CS motion. When you sell an end-to-end platform up front, then our motion becomes a lot less about focusing on getting into expansion and a lot more about ensuring that a customer is utilizing all of the features they bought. So how do we make sure that they don't buy all of, they come to us with this DevSecOps vision, but then they only actually ever end up using SEM. So it's more of a defend motion for us of like, let's ensure you've bought this, like let's align on this and make sure that you're set up for success in using all of these features. So it's a different motion for us, but yeah.
Do you also have strategies like the percentage use of features makes a lot of sense, the total utilization, but it's also like if they use that feature, they're gonna see they miss this thing that we could sell. Do you have specific strategies for drive upsell? So this and these 3 features that you have to have them use because of that, or not the way it works?
It does to a degree, yeah, but it's more around the use cases than particular features necessarily. So maybe our security use case is an example. So it might be our SaaS plus our DAS and our container scanning. It's not as simple as just the one. But yeah, we typically see customers being much more successful when they're using multiple use cases, because now you're talking about removing friction and silos between teams and all the things that that a unified platform gives you.
Amazing. I've learned so much. This is so cool. I start to become a CSM nerd. I love this
Well,
stuff.
good.
And I have 2 questions at the end. They're both short. First
Please.
question is, where do people go to nerd out on this? Where do you go to learn more about this? Where do you draw inspiration from?
Yeah, so I will again say that all of our processes are in the handbook. So there's probably nothing that I've told you today that you can't find in writing, and it's all public. But Gainsight is really an authority in the space. So Gainsight's got a great blog. They've got tons of resources. They do courses. They've got a great early CSM course. So if you wanted a new CSM to go away and do a course somewhere to learn about good CS practices, Gainsight has some fantastic courses that they run. So I would, if I followed anything, I would, and I do follow them very closely and have used. I very much advocate. They're the new Salesforce. So if Salesforce coined the term, Gainsight gave explanation to what it looks like in the modern day.
Nice. Yeah, that must be good the way you give them praise. That's really cool. And Salesforce still earned the money because it's own Salesforce, right? So they win.
Yeah.
Salesforce always
there's
win.
There's no conflict.
We got a question slipped in here. Where can you find the handbook? Where can you find the?
Yes,
I assume
you bet.
GitLab handbook, Google.
Yep.